starting to pick up now.
Like I said, folks, we iron sharpens iron, and it's good to have a real challenge out there, a real option. And we're talking, again, Nick Polce, I said it before, he's a father, he's a husband, businessman, Army Green Beret combat veteran. He brings a unique perspective, and the man answered questions on our show directly and to the point. I'm very happy to hear that. And listen, Nick, I wish you the best of luck, and keep at it, man. You picked a steep hill, and can't wait to see how you do climbing it. Good luck to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Gene. It's worth the climb.
So there we go, folks. That was Nick Polce, and the good majority of the interview we did with him. Again, check out the rest of it on the podcast where we have some chatting about his background and what he did, or some mutual friends we have, things like that. And what we're going to do right now is going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we're going to have an interview with Julie Poner. You're going to hear her amazing story and hopefully learn something about immigration marriage fraud that maybe you didn't know before listening to this show. I'm telling you, folks, it's a good listen. Probably one of the most important interviews we've ever done on the show. Gene Baradelli, Behind Enemy Lines. We'll be back right after these brief words. If you're a long-time listener of the show, or maybe this is your first time listening, you can probably tell that me and the gang here, we like to have our share of fun, whether it's on or off the air. We talk about 2-drink minimum radio and no medication Wednesdays or whatever day it may be. That's why when we found the people at Less Government, More Fun, we knew it was a match made in heaven with this show. Folks, we live in a time where government is out of hand. Our founding fathers did not intend government to be all-consuming in all parts of our lives. That's why we are telling you to go to lessgovmorefun.com, check out the website, check out the swag. What the people want is less government, more fun. Pass it on, make it happen.
Who might you save?
Your mother, your father, your husband, uncle, aunt, son.
Learn FAST, F-A-S-T, the sudden signs of a stroke, and you could save.
Your friend, teacher, boss.
F, face drooping. A, arm weakness. S, speech difficulty. T, time to call 911. F-A-S-T. That's F, face drooping. A, arm weakness. S, speech difficulty. T, time to call 911. The sooner they get to the hospital, the sooner they'll get treatment. And that can make a remarkable difference in the recovery of
your neighbor, the waiter, grandmother, grandfather.
So learn FAST, the sudden signs of a stroke, then pass it on, because you never know who might save you.
Your wife, your colleague.
Spot a stroke fast. Visit strokeassociation.org. Brought to you by the American Stroke Association and the Ad Council.
Behind Enemy Lines Radio is all about being right. No, seriously, it is. If you ever listen to Russ Gallo or me go back and forth on some issue, we always want to make sure that we remember who said what and when we said it. That's why we go to goonrecord.com. It's a brand new social media website. Challenge people on what they believe, whether it's in politics, sports, entertainment, finance, whatever. There's a category for you at goonrecord.com. Check it out right now. Tell us, what do you stand for? It's time for you to go on record. Behind Enemy Lines. Back on the air. Gene Baradelli, back behind Enemy Lines. I'm going to do a little something different on the show here. We're going to be focusing on one issue for the rest of the show, and it's something you may not have heard about in the discussion of illegal immigration that's been going on in the country for well over a year now. We're going to be talking about not only holes in the wall, so to speak, but holes in immigration policy that Washington has refused to address. And we're going to get a little wonky right now with the spokesperson for SAVE and the Coalition to End Domestic Violence. SAVE, of course, being Stop Abusive and Violent Environments. We're talking to Julie Poner. Julie, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you, Gene. It's my pleasure.
So I kind of set up the segment in a weird way here because the national discussion about illegal immigration seems to have been going on, I guess, since 2015, since President Trump announced his candidacy. But there are still sections of it and little nuances that people aren't really aware of. One of them going to be what you're going to introduce us to right now. immigration marriage fraud. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're talking about here?
Oh, I'm happy to. And as you said, there are a lot of issues with immigration, not just the southern border, but loopholes exist in many of our laws allowing immigrants to defraud not only American citizens, but then eventually our system through circumventing immigration law. And in my case, I was fortunate enough to be asked to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee at the last hearing to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, as it's more commonly referred to. And my testimony, Jean, was specific to immigration-related marriage and the misuse of the Violence Against Women Act, which allows an immigrant to self-petition, not through their American spouse, but to self-petition for a green card, claiming to be a battered and abused spouse.
Which is much different than the immigration marriage fraud that we're used to talking about, right? We're used to talking about, either a U.S. citizen being paid to marry a foreign national, or, a foreign national is defrauding a U.S. citizen who believes that the marriage is legitimate, or, mail order marriages that that are sexy issues that we hear in the news. We don't hear about what happens after a marriage is seen as quote unquote valid in the country, right? So why don't you walk us through the steps of how this sort of scheme works for these immigrants coming to the country?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And you're absolutely right. There are really two ways to define marriage fraud. As you said, there's either the one-sided, where an American citizen marries a foreign national innocently enough, believing that they are entering into a valid marriage. And then there's the other kind, which we hear a lot about, if we hear anything at all about immigration marriage, and that's the collusive or contract marriage, where both parties are engaging, likely for money is exchanged to help a foreign national game the system through marriage, because unfortunately marriage remains one of the quickest paths to citizenship. And Senator Grassley acknowledged that and admonished Congress with that quote during the last VAWA reauthorization. So it's so simple, Jean. A foreign national can marry an American, can claim spousal abuse, and immediately receive deferred status. So they're not deported. The claim of spousal abuse, because of the power of the Violence Against Women Act, is accepted on first impression. There's no interview, no pesky interview for the immigrant with an immigration official. It's a ridiculously simple and horrible way to defraud an American and essentially game our immigration system, receive services, legal and otherwise, and remain in the country.
Right, and it just goes to show you that once that initial check is done, with I guess it's USCIS, right? That would be Citizens and Immigration Services for the government. Once that initial check is done to see whether or not a marriage is quote unquote valid or not, there really is nothing much that the government does afterwards, and then you basically become almost a victim the second time from the government in having to be subjected to the criminal justice system based upon no evidence. It's absolutely crazy to think about, and yet government doesn't take care. Government doesn't even want to step into this, right? It seems like this is a willful loophole.
And unfortunately, I would have to agree, especially now after the last reauthorization for VAWA, which comes around every 5 years. There was plenty of testimony and evidence presented to show how easy it is for an immigrant with an agenda to defraud the American citizen and enter the country. So what we're learning is that VAWA, like so many laws, is now very political. It's partisan. VAWA advocates and proponents don't want to hear from American citizens who were defrauded. They refuse to acknowledge, so let's take your term willfully, refuse to acknowledge that the way VAWA is implemented in immigration proceedings, it's creating a new class of victims, the American citizen. And you're right, Jean, not only is the government failing to recognize that these immigrants should be vetted, which at that point then becomes an issue for all of America. If we don't know who's coming into the country, as we all know, that creates a real problem. And that's the basis for, I think, revisiting immigration law, and then especially in this case, taking a real firm look at the Violence Against Women Act and requiring those advocates who, if they truly want services to go to victims, then should be as outraged about this flaw as the American citizens are.
Absolutely. Now, let's just say you didn't get to become the spokesperson for SAVE and the Coalition to End Domestic Violence just by happenstance, or just because this is, a important issue to you just out of the blue. Why don't you tell everybody your story and how this actually is very personal for you?
Well, I'd be happy to. So years ago, I married a man from the Czech Republic. We married in Prague. Our children were born there. We began to build a life there and a business, and decided to relocate to the United States. Once we settled in Massachusetts, it was only natural the next step would be to apply for his legal permanent residency or his green card, which I did. Days after receiving notice that we would have our first interview with immigration officials, he informed me that we would be getting a divorce now. And I think now was the operative word. In other words, it was now time for him to move on. He had everything that he wanted at that point, except the green card, but I think got a little bit ahead of himself in thinking that he was in a good spot. Which is also something that many of the immigrants know. They know before marrying the American what our laws are and how they work. And so he, again, I think felt secure enough to announce that we would be getting a divorce. He instructed me to continue to sponsor him for his green card, or he said he would take our twin toddlers. They were 3 years old at that time, had just turned 3. He would take them back to the Czech Republic. So I was stunned. I had no idea that this was coming. At that point, I still thought I had a marriage to salvage, but I learned very quickly about immigration marriage fraud, about international child abduction, and then a little bit later down the road, I learned about the state of our family court system. So I was actually, I hate to use the term victim, but that's how it's defined and that's how it applies. And so my children and I were now victims of immigration marriage fraud. But what's interesting, I think, Jean, if I could quickly touch on the power of VAWA again, we had our interview with immigration officials, and they almost immediately escorted my husband out of the room, confiscated his passport, brought a supervisor into the room, and they explained to me in no uncertain terms that I was a victim of marriage fraud. So they were sorry to inform me, but then made me aware that if I continued to sponsor him, given the information that they had and what they were sharing with me at that interview, I could potentially face federal prosecution for marriage fraud. So I withdrew my petition, thinking I was compliant now with our federal government, only to find out down the road that at his deportation hearing, he used the Violence Against Women Act, claimed to be a battered and abused spouse, dodged deportation. His file went to a central authority where domestic violence-trained adjudicators working under immigration law processed his application, and he remained in the country.
Which is an absolutely amazingly horrific story. And when you think about that, you were trying to follow the law. You were put on notice by the government that you were being the victim of this, and then to have the laws of your own country enforced against you by someone claiming protection under it that had no entitlement to do so. You had to be in a state of shock through this whole time. How ultimately did you get through this?
Well, I just continued to pursue what I thought was a problem that needed to be fixed. So naively enough in the beginning, I just figured that no one knew what was happening. And I think